picking up in growth of the American Republic. From Chapter 2, Part 4, there is a footnote on the following. Owing to Legazpi's tact, the friendly attitude of the natives, and not least the fact that they had no gold or other precious commodities. Footnote: the Philippines in 1939 held 5th place among the gold-producing countries of the world, after South Africa, Canada, the United States, and Australia, but the Spaniards did not discover the gold deposits. End of footnote. Continuing. Chapter 2, Part 5, Conquest of a Continent. The entire east coast of South America had been explored, and Magellan was already on his way around the world before the two most splendid native civilizations in America, those of Mexico and Peru, had yielded their secrets. In 1519, the governor of Cuba, wishing to establish a trading post on the Mexican coast, sent an expedition of 11 ships carrying in all only 550 Spaniards under young Hernando Cortes, arriving at a time when the natives of Mexico were chafing under the cruel sovereignty of the Aztecs. Cortes was welcomed by many as their fabled hero, Quetzalcoatl, and he had the wit to take advantage of it. Before all that, the conquest of Mexico was one of the most amazing military and diplomatic feats in the world's history. The march up from Vera Cruz to the great interior plateau, the audacious capture of Montezuma's lake-rimmed capital, 1521, and the defeat of the vast army on the plains of Teotihuacan. The march up from Vera Cruz to the great interior plateau, the audacious capture of Montezuma's lake-rimmed capital, 1521, and the defeat of a vast army on the plains of Teotihuacan. The march up from the Vera Cruz to the great interior plateau, the audacious capture of Montezuma's lake-rimmed capital, 1521, and the defeat of a vast army on the plains of Teotihuacan, completed the ruin of the Aztec power, and firmly established Cortes as master of Mexico. The results of this conquest in terms of treasure were spectacular, and the prospect of more to come was infinite. Hence America, for the first time, became popular in Europe. Certain districts of Spain were depopulated by the gold rush to the Indies. The Antilles were deserted by all but the less vigorous colonists. It might be supposed that liquidation of the Aztec Empire and exploitation of Mexican sources would employ the energies of Spain for a century. Yet this conquest was only a beginning. The whole southern section of the United States from South Carolina across to California was explored by Spanish conquistadors in search of more valuable treasure, new empires that might challenge Mexico, and the fabled Strait of Anian, which was supposed to cross North America from east to west, and might be the long-sought passage to India. Panfilo de Narvaez, who had been badly treated by Cortes, chose Florida for his field of glory, and sailed thither from Spain in 1527. Panfilo was the most unfortunate of the conquistadors. After losing 2 ships in a hurricane, he landed somewhere on the Gulf Coast of Florida, fought his way up to the site of Tallahassee, returned to the coast, and there built a fleet of boats from native wood fastened with spikes fashioned from spurs and stirrups, rigged with hair cordage and hide sails from the horses which his men had eaten. In these crazy craft, he sailed past the mouths of the Mississippi, only to be wrecked on the coast of Texas. The sole survivors, Cabeza de Vaca, 2 other Spaniards, and a Negro, spent 6 years among the Indians and eventually reached Mexico, with tales of wild hunchback cows that covered the plains as far as eye could see, and of cities with emerald-studded walls, of which they had heard. These 7 cities of Cibola were more readily believed in than were the buffalo. In 1539, the Viceroy of Mexico sent a Franciscan named Fra Marcos, accompanied to Esteban, the Negro companion of Cabeza de Vaca, up into the future New Mexico in search of the fabled 7 cities. There they discovered the disappointing foundation of this myth, the Zuni Pueblos, and so reported, but the honest tale of Fray Marcos was so blown up by popular imagination that the Viceroy sent north the most splendid exploring expedition of all, that of Francisco Vasquez Coronado, while a cooperating fleet sailed up the Gulf of California. One of Coronado's lieutenants discovered the Grand Canyon in 1540. Coronado himself marched eastward across the panhandle of Texas into eastern Kansas, only to prick another rumor, and returned disappointed to Mexico. Hernando de Soto, who had served under Pizarro in Peru in the meantime, had obtained a grant of Florida from the king. Landing at Tampa Bay, he marched about the interior of the future Gulf states for many months, led on by those tales of splendid cities. In 1541, he came upon the Mississippi near Memphis, crossed to the west bank, spent the winter near Fort Smith, Arkansas, returned to the Father of Waters, and there died. His men built boats, descended the Mississippi, crossed the Gulf, and reached Tampico in safety after an absence of over 4 years. Owing to the failure to find treasure or a strait, these Spanish explorations of North America had no immediate result. The tide of conquest turned towards South America. Only at the end of the 16th century, when the frontier of settlement and mining in Mexico had been pushed so near to the Rio Grande that conquest of the Puebli Indians seemed desirable. Juan de Onate formally took possession of all the kingdoms and provinces of New Mexico. The Pueblos promptly submitted, colonization began, and the next governor found its Santa Fe in 1609. Thus, New Mexico, last but one of the 48 states to be admitted to the Union, was settled at the same time as the first English colony of Virginia. By that time, Spain had conquered almost the whole of South America down to the river Plate. Francisco Pizarro had overthrown the mighty Inca Empire. Francisco Pizarro had overthrown the mighty Inca Empire of Peru and founded Lima by 1535. Other conquistadors swarmed southward and eastward, overrunning the whole of the continent. By mid-century, the foundations had been laid for every one of the 20 republics of Central and South America, excepting the Argentine. There has been no other conquest like this in the annals of the new human race. In one generation, the Spaniards acquired more new territory than Rome conquered in 5 centuries. Genghis Khan swept over a greater area, but left only destruction in his wake. The Spaniards organized and administered all that they conquered, brought in the arts and letters of Europe, and converted millions to their faith. Our forebears in Virginia and New England, the pathfinders of the Great West, and the French-Canadian pioneers were stout fellows indeed, but their exploits scarcely compared with these of Spanish conquistadors and friars, who hacked their way in armor through solid jungle, across endless plains, and over snowy passes of the Andes to fulfill their dreams of gold and glory, and for whom reality was greater even than the dream. There is another side to the picture, the inordinate greed for gold, and the revolting cruelty to which the Indians were often subjected. Yet, too, there was the faith and the chivalrous courtesy that their descendants have inherited, and the arts that followed fast on the trail of conquest. Mexico and Lima, the city of a Mexico and Lima, the city of kings, became seats of urban civilization within 15 years of the conquest. In each, a university was founded in 1551. The first printing press in the New World came to Mexico City in 1539, and the first imprint was a compendium of Christian doctrine. En lingua mexicana y castellana, composed for the Indians by the Bishop of Teotihuacan. Oh, fuck, I hate the fucking name. The first printing press in the New World came to Mexico City in 1539, and the first imprint was a compendium of Christian doctrine in lingua mexicana y castellana, composed for the Indians by the Bishop of Teotihuacan. Even today, an air of superb magnificence rests on the churches and palaces built by these children of the sun, in their provincial capitals, hundreds of miles from the sea. Teotihuacan. Thus the Spanish Empire in America had more than a century's head start on the English and French, and the results of that conquest, materially as well as spiritually, were amazing, stupendous, and the envy of every European power. Spanish prestige reached its height in the year 1580, when Philip II succeeded to the throne of Portugal, as well as that of Spain, uniting in his person the two vast empires that stretched their arms around the world. At that moment, not another nation had placed a single permanent settler on the shores of the New World. Not even a fort of trading post challenged the monopoly of Spain and Portugal in America. Yet the end of the monopoly was near. The autumn gales of 1580 blew up the English Channel and into Plymouth Harbor Francis Drake in the Golden Hind, worm-eaten and weed-clogged, after her 3 years' voyage around the world, laden with the spoil of a Peruvian treasure ship. The autumn gales of 1580 blew up the English Channel and into Plymouth Harbor Francis Drake in the Golden Hind, worm-eaten and weed-clogged after her 3 years' voyage round the world, laden with the spoil of a Peruvian treasure ship. Only 8 years more, and Spain suffered her first major defeat on the ocean, and she had mastered. Fuck! Only 8 years more, and Spain suffered her first major defeat on the ocean that she mastered. 20 years more, and Virginia was founded. 6. In northern waters. Spanish conquest was too swift and successful for the health of Spain. American treasure ruined her manufactures, financed useless military adventures of her kings, and led to poverty and ineptitude in the next century. Yet the immediate success, which alone was visible, stimulated 3 other nations: France, England, and the Netherlands to acquire colonial possessions of their own. As early as 1521, some French corsairs bagged part of the booty that Cortés was sending home, and this process of muscling into the Spanish Empire continued until England and France were firmly established in North America, and the Dutch in the Far East. John Cabot discovered the teeming codfishers of the Grand Bank of Newfoundland, but French and Portuguese fishermen were first to profit by them. Norman fishermen were on the banks by 1504, and the Portuguese were so active about Newfoundland for a generation after Court Real's discovery that even today the principal bays and headlands of Newfoundland have Portuguese names. These fishermen were practical men who were only concerned in catching and curing the firm-fleshed cod of northern waters that fed a ready market in Europe. The important explorations in northern waters, as along the Spanish Main, were made by navigators seeking a passage to India. Francis I of France, who liked to be in the swim, engaged a Florentine navigator to find him, for fuck's sake. Francis I of France, who liked to be in the swim, engaged a Florentine navigator to find for him the water route to China. This Giovanni Verrazzano, in the summer of 1524, made the first voyage, of which we have definite record, along the Atlantic coast of the United States from Cape Fear to Maine, searching for the strait. He entered the future New York harbor, but decided that the Hudson was not a passage. He tried Narragansett Bay, and again drew a blank. He sailed among the spruce-clad islands of Maine, and then home. By that time, Francis I had been captured at the Battle of Pavia, and could no longer finance exploration. Verrazzano's brother made a map of his voyages that showed a mythical gulf of the Pacific stretching to within a few miles of Chesapeake Bay, probably the efforts of Indians to tell about the Great Lakes was the origin of this Sea of Verrazzano, the search for which lasted almost 2 centuries. Every Englishman who marched inland from the Atlantic coast, even Governor Spotswood, as late as 1716, hoped to play Balboa at the first crest of the Blue Ridge. Jacques Cartier is the Columbus of French Canada. This hardy seaman of St. Malo made 3 voyages to the Gulf of St. Lawrence, 1534 to 1541, in search of the passage to the Orient. On the second, he discovered the Rock of Quebec, in a region which the natives called Canada, and then proceeded upstream past Montreal, so named by him, to the lowest rapids of the St. Lawrence, which he humorously called Lachine. He wintered near the mouth of the Saguenay, and collected from the Indians a cycle of tall tales about an inland kingdom of that name, where gold and silver were as plentiful as in Mexico or Peru. King Henry II of France, much excited at this prospect, then equipped Cartier with a fleet of so formidable that the Spanish government seriously discussed sending naval vessels to sink it. But the Spanish king wisely concluded that it would be a good thing to keep the French busy chasing northern will-o'-the-wisps. Cartier brought back nothing but a shipload of iron pyrites, or fool's gold, and of quartz crystal that he believed to be diamonds. France then fell into a cycle of religious wars, and although every year Norman and Breton fishermen visited the banks and cured their fish ashore, and traded with the natives for fur, no progress was made toward establishing a French-American empire until the next century. The settled history of Canada began when Samuel de Champlain in 1608 planted the white standard of St. Louis on the rock of Quebec. Seven. Enter England. England approached America very gingerly. The Cabot voyages were not her only false starts, for England was a small and poor country, hemmed in by enemies. Independent and hostile Scotland sat on her northern border, and hereditary enemy France lay across one channel. And Ireland, who still refused to admit she had been conquered, across the another. English monarchs of the House of Tudor were cautious, impecunious, and anxious to placate the Spanish sovereigns. Henry VII played safe. Henry VIII, 1509 to 1547, built up the Royal Navy, but wasted money on the continent. The chief overseas effect of his reign was to the northeast. The Muscovy Company, first of a long line of joint stock corporations that carried the English flag to the far corners of the world, opened a trade with Ivan the Terrible by way of the White Sea and Archangel. England was growing stronger year by year. No small share of the treasure from Mexico and Peru went by English woolens, for woolen garments were still the fashion for both sexes, even in warm climates. In 1500, English foreign trade had been largely in the hands of foreigners. Gradually the Italians and Portuguese were squeezed out, and the exclusive privileges of the Hanseatic League for northern trade were revoked. Henry VIII's embracing of the Lutheran schism, whatever his motive, stimulated English nationalism and made a break with Spain sooner or later inevitable. The secularization of the monasteries released capital for foreign trade, and young men for adventure. Many a youth who might have found a safe career in the church under a Catholic regime now had to seek a living from the sea. Under Queen Elizabeth, England definitely aligned herself with the Protestant Reformation, which made it a religious as well as a patriotic duty to singe the King of Spain's beard. The obvious place to harry that monarch's whiskers was in the West Indies. Spanish commerce with her overseas possessions was conducted by convoys and staple towns on the coast. The outward-bound fleet from Spain made the West Indies at Guadalupe and then split separate squadrons producing to Santo Domingo, Cartagena, Portobello on the Isthmus of Panama, and Vera Cruz, the port of Mexico. All commerce with Peru and the west coast was conducted through Panama. The precious metals were transported by mule train across the Isthmus to Portobello, where at the time of the annual fair, ingots of silver were piled up in the marketplace like cordwood. On the homeward passage, galleons from Caribbean and Gulf ports sailed through the Yucatan Channel and made rendezvous at the Havana, whence the Gulf Stream bore them up through the Straits of Florida to the zone of westerly winds. In the 1560s, John Hawkins of Plymouth began to make slaving voyages from England to Africa, and then to Spanish America, where his courtly manners and attractive prices ensured a good reception, albeit that trade was against the law. Then, on his third and troublesome voyage, he was set upon by the Spanish fleet in Vera Cruz, and roughly handled. His captain, Francis Drake, became the most implacable enemy to Spain, raiding the isthmus and coast towns again and again, and on his memorable voyage to California, and round the world, striking terror along the coast of Chile and Peru. Thomas Cavendish, a sea captain who in his early 20s commanded the second English voyage around the world, bagged the grandest prize of all, a Manila galleon. His ships entered the Thames, rigged with silken sails, and each sailor wore a chain of pure gold around his neck. The great age of Elizabeth and of Shakespeare, in which English genius burned brightly in almost every aspect of life, was reaching its acme. This happy breed of men, this little world, this precious stone set in the silver sea. Then awakened from long lethargy to a feeling of exuberant life, such as few people had known since ancient Greece. That was an age when the scholar, the divine, and the man of action were often one and the same person, for the Elizabethans knew that many of us have forgotten that life is empty without religion, that the tree of knowledge is barren unless rooted in love, and that learning, purchased at the expense of living, is a sorry bargain. Man in those days was not ashamed to own himself an animal, nor so base as to quench the divine spark that made him something better. But above all, he exulted in the fact that he was a man. Chapman, in Byron's Conspiracy, spoke of his age and generation when he cried out, "Be free, all worthy spirits, and stretch yourselves." The age of discovery in England was closely integrated with English literature, promoted by her governing class, and a matter of great moment to the government of Sir Humphrey. The age of discovery in England was closely integrated with English literature, promoted by her governing class, and a matter of great moment to the government. Sir Humphrey Gilbert, Oxonian educational reformer and courtier, published a discourse of a discovery for a new passage to Kitaya, i.e. China, and attempted the first English colony. His half-brother, Sir Walter Raleigh, courtier, soldier, and historian, founded Virginia and sought El Dorado up the Orinoco, and the Rav, Richard Hakluyt, student of Christ Church in Oxford, compiled his great collection of navigations, voyages, and discoveries of the English nation, in order to fire his countrymen to worthy deeds overseas. The English Empire, down to the American Revolution, was but a fulfillment of the plans made by Hakluyt. Gilbert Raleigh, and a number of other promoters in the reign of Queen Bess. What these men wanted was an overseas empire that would make England self-sufficient and employ a great merchant marine. It should be in a climate where Englishmen might live, and where they and natives would provide a new market for English woolens. The colonies should produce tar and timber for shipbuilding, gold and silver, dyewoods, wine, spices, and olives, and everything else that England was then buying from abroad. The Indians must be converted to Protestant Christianity in order to stay the progress of the Counter-Reformation. A passage through was sought to the real Indies that would serve as an English Straits of Magellan. Yet, with all this energy, gallantry, and enthusiasm, the chronicle of English colonization in the 16th century is one of the repeated failure. Martin Frobisher sought gold and the Northwest Passage in the 1570s, discovered Hudson Strait, and brought back shiploads of worthless fool's gold. Sir Humphrey Gilbert took possession of Newfoundland for the Queen in 1583, but was lost on the voyage home. Sir Walter Raleigh then took over his patent to the whole of North America above Florida, named it Virginia, and planted 2 successive colonies on Roanoke Island. The first gave up after a year. The second, a well-chosen group of 117 men, women, and children, had completely disappeared by the time a relief expedition arrived in 1590. Reasons for these and other failures are not far to seek. England had a national policy of overseas expansion, but her efforts were left to individuals and the Reasons for these and other failures are not far to seek. England had a national policy of overseas expansion, but her efforts were left to individuals, and the experience of Gilbert and Raleigh proved what they might have learned from the Spaniards, that it is a difficult thing to carry over colonies into remote countries upon private men's purses. The English crown was too impecunious to finance colonies, and individual enterprise preferred the gay adventure and almost certain profit of raiding Spanish possessions and capturing Spanish ships. These activities increased both the confidence and the sea knowledge of the English, and so contributed in the end to imperial achievement. But as long as the war with Spain lasted, and it lasted as long as did Elizabeth, it was impossible to obtain enough capital or men for the prosaic business of planting and maintaining a colony. So the 16th century closed like the 15th without a single Englishman on American soil. Unless survivors of Raleigh's lost colony were still wandering through the forest of Carolina. All this was most discouraging, but the English were past discouragement, for underlying all their efforts, the earlier failures as well as later successes, was a powerful drive which thrust them forward no matter what happened, an ideal motive similar to the terrific missionary fervor of the Spaniards. This daemon of the English was the burning desire to found a new England, a new society, in which all the best of the past would be conserved, but where life would have a different and better quality from anything then conceivable in Europe. It was typical of an English discoverer that Sir Humphrey Gilbert, when last seen on the quarterdeck of the Golden Hind, was reading a book, and from the phrase that he joyfully shouted to his men, "We are as near heaven by sea as by land," that book must have been Sir Thomas More's Utopia, the utopian ideal for America, which was in the mind of every important group of English pioneers from Massachusetts to Georgia, takes off from the Utopia of Sir Thomas More, first printed in 1516. The ideal commonwealth to that saintly mind is described as an island set in the ocean sea somewhere in the New World. It is in the North Zone, the air soft, temperate, and gentle, the ground covered with green grass, full of people, governed by good and wholesome laws, but no lawyers, where everyone is honestly employed and no one exploited or overworked. In the cities, planted not less than a day's journey apart, dwell the handicraftsmen and men of learning. But each city possesses a great rural district studded with cooperative farms. Burghers and farmers change places every 2 years, so that each has his share of necessary labor, and nobody becomes bored with his occupation. All alike labor 9 hours a day, leaving ample time for recreation and 8 hours for sleep. All alike labor 9 hours a day, leaving ample time for recreation and 8 hours for sleep. Husbandry is made pleasant and easy by having oxen to do all the heavy work, and by inventions such as incubators for raising chickens. In the cities, the streets are laid out, very commodious and handsome, 20 feet wide, and the houses be of fair and gorgeous building, each of 3 stories, fireproof, amply windowed, provided with a garden, and drained by a system of canals. None are owned privately. All change hands every decade. Government is carried on by a series of town meetings. They choose an electoral college which elects a council of philosophers and a prince who holds his office for life. Free and compulsory education is continued for adults by daily lectures, which all attend except such as wish to bestow the time well and thrifty upon some other science, as shall please them, for utopians like nothing better than free liberty of the mind and the garnishing the same. And often it chanceth that the handicraftsman doth so earnestly bestow his vacant and spare hours in learning, and through diligence so profiteth therein, that he is taken from his handy occupation and promoted to the company of the learned. Greek literature is the favorite study of these workers' educational classes. And just backing up a bit, there is a footnote on this page concerning Sir Thomas More's writing Utopia. Footnote: the way to heaven out of all places is of like length and distance. One of the maxims of Raphael, the Portuguese, who discovered Utopia in Book 1. End of footnote. Utopia cultivates community life as well as individual achievement. Everyone residing on the same farm or in the same city ward dines and sups in a great hall, and after supper there are debates and community music. The utopians' time is not taken up with superfluities, for they build solidly, dress simply, care nothing for gambling, cruel sports, or wasteful display, and despise gold, silver, and jewels. All products are considered common. Each head of the family helps himself at the storehouse to what he needs, and the aged or infirm are provided with all their wants. Attendance by physicians and free hospitalization are provided for everyone. Whoever wishes to make a pleasure trip is provided by the government with an ox wagon, but he has to work in the farms or cities that he visits in order to eat. The Utopians hate warfare as a thing very beastly, yet both men and women submit to compulsory military training in case other and less happy people seek to invade them or attack countries that are their friends. All their wars heretofore have been in defense of friendly countries. The Utopians, knowing that if these were conquered by tyrants, their turn would come next. Timely offensive, they count the best defense, and engines for war they devise and invent. Timely offensive, they count the best defense. The engines for war they devise and invent wonders wittily. The Utopians enjoy complete religious liberty, and although they cultivate virtue, which they define as life ordered according to nature, they judge it extreme madness to follow sharp and painful virtue, and banish the pleasure of life. Thus, out of the welter of misery, insecurity, and corruption that were the lot of common man in the England of 1516, came this vision of a new and better society, the American dream. One constant thread of American history has been this quest for peace, liberty, and the security. One constant thread of American history has been this quest for peace, liberty, and security. This effort, often frustrated, never realized but in part, yet ever hopeful, ever renewed, to make true the utopian dream of the blessed Thomas More. End of chapter 2.